we have a kind of human resources process to select people to run for offices, very much in the same way as companies do to hire the senior managers. We have like hundreds of people volunteering to run for office, and we have a pretty high refusal rate, but not all of them go the full way. We have now something like 300, 400 people running for office in local or federal Congress around the country. Plus, we're running in 5 states for governor. In a few states, we have candidates for the Senate and a candidate for the presidency. None of us has had any previous experience in politics. This sounds even more naive than the rest of the governance provisions we would like to adopt, but it's been pretty successful. And I can tell you, myself, I come from a well-organized party. I've been member of PSDB, that's the Social Democratic Party, since 1989, and the experience is like the one of leaving behind a mature organization, perhaps too mature, and going to work for a startup. And that is pretty much what we are in the field of politics in Brazil, a startup with disruptive ideas on the ways political parties should organize. Our stance, for instance, against the use of public funds for the party is pretty strong and popular. No other party refuses to use public money. This is a feature of the Brazilian electoral politics that is different from the US. Here in this country, there's budget allocations for political parties in normal times and during the election, special allocations. We refuse to touch that money. There's also free TV time for political parties. The time is allocated in proportion to representation. So new parties like us have a few seconds in like a 2-hour time TV has to devote to political campaign during the campaign. These are all barriers to competition. We have to fight against all that. But in this new landscape of social media, it's not as difficult as we thought it should be. And as we speak, our presidential candidate has 4% of the vote. This is pretty remarkable. Well, you hearing me? It's kind of.
I hear you fine, yes.
Okay, that came back. So as we moved 2 weeks back from now, from 1% to 4% is like we are now a player, a contender in this election. It's pretty much open, and we were kind of nice try, an experiment, and now with 4%, we're talking like 5 million individuals inclined or decided to vote with us, and that is relevant in the grand scheme of things here in Brazil. This is perhaps what is more special about us in the political arena is not only that, is our stance in economics, in the economy, what we think. And here, this is the field I can speak more freely. There wasn't before us, surprisingly as it may seem, any other political party that openly defended pro-market positions. Pro-market meaning things related not only to fiscal responsibility, balanced budgets, tax reform, social security reform for fiscal reasons and fiscal responsibility needs and stuff like that, but also the liberal agenda in the sense of opening the economy, advancing labor reform, perhaps even thinking about extinguishing labor courts, and the doing business agenda that comes out of the IFC report. Very popular today, very special help for reformers around the world, here in this country too. But again, I lived in public office for a number of years, and I remember how it works in Brasilia. And it's true that as you sit in a congressional committee, you know you cannot talk about free markets and stuff like that because they don't like it. No party has commitment to that. It sounds ugly for the political establishment in Brazil, and it's a mystery that in a country like Brazil, the free market ideas, the free market rhetoric is so much I don't know. It's like it's forbidden in the normal course of things in Brasilia. You have to talk about the role of the state, the social policies. I guess it's not only Brazil with that. There's a lot of political correctness in Brazilian Congress, but the strange absence was that why has never any other party before us adopted or openly embraced ideas related to free markets. And remember that the free market agenda in Brazil is not the same as in the US. It's not like being the Republican Party of the US in Brazil is different. What we say in the economy sounds liberal in the American sense for the American ear. It's kind of strange. We're some decades late in our agenda in terms of having a freer economy. But a number of circumstances have worked to make all of a sudden the liberal agenda in the Brazilian sense, the liberalism, something fashionable in Brazil, even popular. You see today every candidacy in the country has a US PhD advising the candidate. In our case, it's Harvard. You look at the others, it's MIT, Chicago, all the best schools in the US are providing their PhDs to advise our presidential candidates. It was never like that. There's all the interest in hearing from people like me in events like this. It wasn't like that. You want to hear the president, and the president doesn't talk economics in any profound way. That's the way it was in Brazil always. Now, however, is different. And even in my old party, the Social Democratic Party, PSDB, well, they have as a economic advisor Partido, with whom I work with during the Real Plan. It's an exceptional economist and human being. They're pretty much well served. And I can say similar words to many of the other advisors serving other candidates. But the question raised now in Brazil is whether these individuals are influential as they claim in their campaigns. And the question is not raised in our case, but it's commonly raised in connection with my friend Paulo Guedes and Jair Bolsonaro, his boss. And let me not talk about them, let me talk about us. Novo is now a party that is one of the largest in Brazil in terms of affiliations, which is kind of strange for such a young organization. And there's something grassroots about Novo, which surprised me a lot. It reminds me also a lot what I saw in the late 80s with the Workers' Party. In that case, it was the unions and the church having grassroots organizations around the country. These produced a political party at a point out of a social movement. In our case, it's a different situation. I think there's two elements contributing to make Novo a nationwide social movement. One is the impeachment, as I mentioned, indignation, anger about political process, the way it works in Brazil, was instrumental to make us big. The second thing, I guess, it was something that we can appreciate and thank Dilma Rousseff, which was basically the failure of the monumental failure of Dilma Rousseff was something that ruined the old economic agenda, the old populist agenda, in a very clear way. And in this particular situation, that failure had three features that are worth explaining. One was macro failure, and the notion that you can kind of reinvent macroeconomic theory to do budget deficits without thinking on tomorrow and nothing will happen, things like that, resulted into the largest recession ever in Brazilian history. We had 2 years of GDP falling 3.5%, 7% fall in 2 years. That is huge. Not even in the Great Depression we had something like that. It's a macro failure of incomparable extent. Then there's a micro failure. Having Petrobras at the very center of the experiment, I think the idea under Dilma Rousseff was to kind of reinvent relationships between the private and the public, having Petrobras at the center, maybe trying to construct something Asian or Russian, I'm not sure, in which the relationships between large public companies and structures and private big business was to be governed by personal political relations in what is normally called crony capitalism. That was the kind of thing Dilma Rousseff was trying to implement in Brazil. And they have their eyes also on the oil discoveries and the form on the fact that this new oil could be the fuel for all this engine, as it works in Venezuela or in Russia. I don't know. And Petrobras was at the very center of that. And it was a major failure. If you look at Petrobras individually, it was a company worth $250 billion the time it sold shares in New York in 2010, around that. There was a point it was worth 17 billion. It was almost bankrupt. When you think of bankrupting Petrobras after the oil discoveries of the pre-salt in the Brazilian offshore, is remarkable. It's a remarkably horrible achievement that has a profound influence on Brazil, as Petrobras was. There's something religious about Petrobras. Going back to the 50s, Petrobras was the state company owning natural resources coming from the deep heart of the country. We're talking about oil, not surrendering oil to the imperialistic interests and all that. All of a sudden, Petrobras is made bankrupt. And that's horrible. But third, and worse than anything, any of the other two failures, was the corruption scandal and the fact that corruption was made into something very different than we had in the past. It's true that corruption is nothing new in Brazil, but we never had organized corruption as we had in these years. There's a big difference between retail mugging in the streets and organized crime. And that is more or less what we had in Brazil after the procurement process in Petrobras was used to produce financing for political campaign and enrichment of lots of people now in jail. And there was a time Petrobras was forced to go into an impairment process in their balance sheets sometime around 2015. And by this time, auditors then recognized an impairment of 6 billion reais of monies paid for corruption. And it's one of the few cases in world corporate history of a company that has audited corruption. That's 6 billion. But we know that 6 billion is a small portion of the cost of all this experiment. The refinery to be built in the state of Pernambuco in association with the Venezuelan regime was said to cost something like $20 billion out of an original budget of a couple of billion. It's not all corruption. There's an old saying in Brazil that sometimes it's cheaper to pay the commissions, not doing the works. The commissions are 6 billion reais. The refineries that we built without having the need were a multiple of that. So we're talking kind of three failures that changed completely the economic agenda. And I think they opened up a window for Brazilians to rethink deeply the role of state. There was a time in this country you would hear that the liberal rhetoric was sort of foreign to Brazilians, and you could never explain to anyone what a free market liberal economy is. And today, it so happens that it's nothing difficult about explaining why we should have less government. Dilma Rousseff has made it very easy for every Brazilian to understand that government can be very, very bad sometimes and can steal your money in a big way. And we never had it that size, that big. For this reason, to make a long story short, the whole issue of privatization, even Petrobras, is now in a very different temperature. It was almost a sin or sacrilege to talk about privatizing Petrobras, Banco do Brasil, these two specifically, and it's now an open discussion about that. It's still something difficult, of course, but it's an indication that things are pretty different right now. So this is the atmosphere in which a startup focused on new political practices and on a pro-market agenda has all of a sudden become something of some size and some importance in the political process. And as we speak, I think we're growing. I can see the streets, I can smell it. We may not win, but our idea is way larger now than it was ever in the past. And we will probably win in the next 2, 3, 4 elections and make a president, a governor, a substantial part of Congress. I don't know. In our initial year, our expectation today might be to elect something between 10 and 15 congressmen in a Congress of 513. It's small, but it's a very fragmented political party system that we have in Brazil. The party with the largest vote may have like 50, right? So we will be relevant. And not only that, it's going to be like the first time there is a party present in the House with an open commitment to free markets. We have never had that in Brazil. And that creates some discomfort in the other members of Congress. We feel that in a local way, in proportion, of course, with some of our congressmen at the municipal level. We have a few, and we can see how sometimes one man can make the whole thing work different. It's going to be an experiment, and we're pretty optimistic about the way it's going to work. In the economy, we have plans that are ambitious in many ways. We are the ones with the job of bringing the pro-market agenda in a more extreme way, in a more or less censored way compared to other countries. Not that other presidential advisors, friends of mine, think different than myself. Is that their organizations are not as committed as mine with this type of agenda. And there are things that I would guess that Pércio, Paulo, José Márcio would like to champion in their campaigns, but they can't do it. And this is something that I do expect the campaign process to make clear. Paulo as a candidate, works for a candidate that is very nationalistic. We all have questions about whether he would be able to push a trade liberalization agenda or a privatization agenda that would be comfortable to his candidate. So Pércio will face similar difficulties with PSDB, not us. So it's very interesting to be part of the process with the job of speaking more boldly about the issues. And you've been exposed to the issues, I guess, and we tend to think there's kind of a division of two branches of issues to address. In our view, is the first related to the cost of capital in Brazil. It's the biggest economic problem these days, if we're speaking about growth. And the second is productivity, stagnated for a number of years. If you address these two things, you will address many other things that are results of the state of things we have concerning these two variables. Things as inequality, for instance, will be better addressed if we work the productivity agenda well. And this agenda comprises the whole doing business list that everyone can hear, can read from the IFC reports and see where Brazil is under the benchmark. And these are very easily the agenda in our case: how to open a business, close a business, or how many hours of your year a company devotes to complying with tax obligations, stuff like that. There's the micro agenda. There's the labor reform agenda that's pretty important. We have a good start last year, and this is one reform that requires only what we call in this country ordinary law. It's not a constitutional amendment, nothing like that. It requires bigger effort in terms of Congress and the voting. Ordinary law requires simple majority, and this is what it takes to change labor legislation in Brazil. Of course, there are constitutional requirements that we would like to change too, but not essentially. A lot can be done by means of labor reforms, changing parameters that we can move around with an ordinary law. The last year reform was a sort of an initial step in this. There's much more to do. And thirdly, and the mother of all micro reforms in Brazil, is opening up. Brazil is too closed in terms of foreign trade. There's all types of indicators to support that, and all sorts of distortions. The one that I think is more remarkable is the fact that Brazil is a country in which we have every big company, every multinational in the world has a Brazilian operation, and is easy to look into these operations and to compare to the way the company works in other countries. And in this country, multinationals work for their domestic market, and they're very little connected with their global chains of value, which is a direct result of excessive regulation and the import substitution inward bias that we live with since forever. World Bank data about the degree of openness measured by exports plus imports divided by GDP. In 1960, Brazil was 18%. In 2017, the degree of openness in Brazil is 18%, the same as in 1960. There's something wrong about that. In the 1960, if memory serves me right, Korea has a degree of openness of about 9%. It's like 80% or 70% today. Brazil is the last in every ranking about openness. The United States might be close to us in some respects, but it's a very special situation, not comparable. Brazil could be a very different place to work if we are to be a open economy, and an economy that aspires to be part of the globalization machinery. Every setback we see in globalization these days is minor compared to the backwardness we have in that agenda of globalization. So if we win, expect very aggressive moves in that field. And I think also as far as we have some influence in the agenda setting in this country, yes, we see this issue being discussed in an intensity that we haven't seen before. There's a feeling about being left behind. And one number that I keep saying, and also Amoêdo keeps saying, and resonates a lot, is to remember that in the 80s, Brazil and Korea had the same per capita income, both with around 20% of the United States per capita income. Well, these days, Korea has about 3 times this. It's something like 62-63% of the US per capita income, while Brazil continues at 23% of US per capita GDP. So we are sort of stagnated on this relative level compared to the US since the 80s. It's not one lost decade. We're talking about 3.5 lost decades coming to the fourth. So we have to do something different, right? Do the same and expect a different result. We know it's a definition of insanity according to Albert Einstein. So we have to change to that regard. The cost of capital agenda has a two-pronged division there. One is the fiscal agenda. We have to have fiscal fundamentals that will support lower interest rates. And there's a regulatory side of it that is pretty Brazilian, unusual. That's what we have to, in Brazil, a distortion about the cost of credit. The cost of credit is very high compared to the basic interest rates that are very high. Credit card, revolving credit, for instance, has interest rates of 400% per year. Why that? Overdrafts in banking accounts like that. An ordinary cost of capital banking line costs 35% per year, even when the basic interest rate is 6.5%. There's something wrong, very wrong about the cost of credit in Brazil. In some figures, half the credit in Brazil, we call it directed, is credit given by official banks or by private banks following instructions from the central bank. Well, directed credit representing something like 26% of GDP, this is half of all credit in Brazil, costs 9% per year on average, right? The other half of credit in Brazil costs about something like 35% per year. If you take companies, that is, the average is about 23-24%. If you take individuals, cost is something like 45%. There's a big regulatory agenda to try to kind of break up that system, which is one in which actually there's a cost subsidy in order to have half the customers of credit in Brazil paying too little, you have the other half paying too much. And destroying this is one big regulatory agenda that may lead you to the privatization of some of the official banks. And in fact, Banco do Brasil, Caixa Econômica are true candidates for privatization. And to think about deconcentrating the Brazilian banking system, you have to think about privatizing these institutions. Of course, forbidding, not permitting the incumbent banks to be part of the privatization process. The fiscal agenda is the one that is more commonly discussed, and this is where you find the discussion on the primary surplus that we have to recover, public spending, and social security reform. We like a lot a report that former Minister Joaquim Levy has asked the World Bank to produce. It's called a fair adjustment or something like that. In Portuguese is ajuste justo. Is a long report on what is there in fiscal spending to reduce, or where to use your scissors to cut public spending. And the World Bank has come up to a summary of the report is that there's precisely 8.36% of GDP in spending cuts to be done, well identified by the World Bank. and is more than we need to move from the fiscal deficit, the primary deficit that we have today of around 2% of GDP, to go back to +3, the average we had between the years 1998, 2012, 13, more or less. We lived under a fiscal surplus of this magnitude for more than 10 years. It's kind of a mystery. How could we mess up that number so quickly under Dilma Rousseff? But she's capable of doing incredible things. So this was one of her of the feats. We believe, and other campaigns believe too, that in a couple of years we can recover that number. There will be a sort of a clean launching pad for the new president to do aggressive things on the fiscal front by means of spending cuts, and we plan to use this pretty aggressively in the beginning. And it's very important, all right, and then I come to the last piece of all programs, to submit to Congress a new Social Security reform, a new tax reform. We think of a new reform on the hiring and firing of public servants. But the one in which I think we have a new feature is the Social Security reform. There's been much discussion on the pay-as-you-go system in Brazil and its deficit. And we have to do some changes in this system, like on the parameters of the system. Okay, what was left out of the discussion and changes everything is the way we could work to reorganize the pension fund industry in Brazil. We have in Brazil one interesting and funny creatures called FGTS. It's a large thing. It looks like a pension fund. It was created in the 60s as something like a severance fund in replacement for the repeal of the law securing stability on the job for life for anyone working for more than 10 years in a company. In order to repeal that legislation, Congress invented that sort of compulsory saving program to be used by the time every employee left his job. He could use that money if the justification for the layoff was not acceptable, something like that. The fact was that over the years, FGTS became pretty popular, and it may look at a distance like a Chilean pension fund because it has 83 million clients, numbered accounts, participants in the fund, though it doesn't work as a pension fund. It works as a compulsory loan, actually, because government, the way it works is that every employee in the country would pay like 8% of its wage on a monthly basis to that fund, and the one who has the responsibility to pay is the employee, is the company employing the individual on your behalf, on your account, 8%, which represents a revenue of about 120 billion reais per year. But this fund has today something like 450 billion in assets. in 83 million individuals, which are quota holders of this fund. Well, in addition to that, Brazil has something like 250 pension funds, and these pension funds, with approximately 3 million participants, have assets that are more or less to the tune of 800 billion reais, almost double the number of assets, the value of assets in FGTS. Well, the plan of doing something like a big Chilean pension fund in order to kind of build the second pillar of Social Security on the basis of a capitalization process has to be made using this FGTS, that institution. It has to undergo reform to work like a pension fund, which will make a huge difference in the Social Security landscape in Brazil, as we have already in place something that is widespread, known by everybody. All these systems and things are there. The only thing is that the assets of this fund are being kind of misused by the fund that works for the government. One number that keeps boggling my mind is the following. All pension funds in Brazil, these 250 pension funds, between 2003 and 2017, had a profitability accumulated of about 620%, all right, in this 14 years. During these years, FGTS has a accumulated profitability of 95%, right? It's 95 against 620. So resources invested in a pension fund were 6 times more profitable than resources in FGTS. What it means is that for 83 million Brazilians, you have to explain the fact that during this 14 years, they could have like 6 times their assets. They could have like 2.5 trillion reais, and they have only 460 billion, right? Where the difference went to, answer, it went to government. It went to feed public policies. This was funding for housing programs, to programs supporting municipalities in sewage investments and all that. So we have the savings to build up a big pension fund system, big in the sense of widespread. We have already 83 million clients. It's just to redirect the contribution that is made on a monthly basis to a new version of the fund, which instantly becomes the largest savings instrument in the country. And that changes everything when it comes to Social Security reform, because it's good news. Instead of having the government confiscating your savings every month, right? Now you have a retiring program that you can trust, and which will give you respectable retirement in the future, in addition to what the pay-as-you-go system will pay you. So the whole thing about proving new parameters for the pay-as-you-go system, perhaps reducing some rights there, will be more than offset by what is given to people in the reform of this FGTS. FGTS is the acronym for Fundo de Garantia de Tempo de Serviço. It means nothing. Essentially, it's something of the past that we have to change. In summary, we have ambitious ideas in economics. They're not, at least as far as the issues, so different from what you collect from other candidacies and programs. I think we're more ambitious than the others. Our role is to make it ambitious and bring this agenda in its more aggressive form and see how it looks. We're surprised to see the reception of all that. It's been very good. And that changes the agenda, right? And we're happy with the results, but I think I used all the time you've been given to me. Thank you very much for your attention. I think we can move into Q&A as you wish. Thank you very much.
That was certainly a remarkable panorama of Brazil, political, economic history. Just for your information, I was with Petrobras for 17 years and managed to watch this train wreck actually taking place before my eyes. So I have a lot of sympathy. Paulo, I don't know if you want to start. I don't know to what extent you might have to come close to and I apologize for our somewhat deficient technology, but I don't know if you want to lead the conversation, if you have some questions. We can begin.
I have one question.
Can you hear?
Are you listening? Are you listening?
Can you hear?
Yeah, if you really speak loud, if you shout, I can.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. That was very encouraging to hear not just the plans that you have. This morning I was hearing also João Amoêdo in an interview with CBN, and also I had the chance to hear some of the ideas he is saying about Brazil politics and economy. I have one question: is the Brazilian voters prepared for this idea of a small government and taking the state in many areas? How you feel that the sentiment of the voters are in Brazil for this major and important idea for the next election?
Well, it's a very good question. Let me give you some numbers. According to the National Institute of Statistics, the labor force in Brazil is about 100 million people. The number of voters is somewhat higher than that. But out of the 100 million in the labor force, the composition is pretty telling. And the number I like is that we have 27 million that are either entrepreneurs, what we call conta própria, or people without a boss, right, working on their own, and professionals, right? This is the entrepreneurial group, to the extent that they are the ones that know better than we all know what is the cost of having a big government, right? They know about taxes, they know about the tax collectors better than we do. They know about corruption of the tax collectors and all that. So it's not a problem at all to explain to them what less government means, right? It's incredibly popular and easy. And even more, these are mostly the public that we are searching. The free market rhetoric that is now so popular in Brazil is aiming at this public and responding to this public. This public is influential. The only thing that I don't know how to explain is why before that, or before Dilma Rousseff, we didn't have this public so active and so vocal, receptive to the idea of less government. we had to have a really terrible government to convince people that government can be very bad, right? And we thank Dilma Rousseff for that every day.
That's good.
Gustavo, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. No, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the budget. And the budget for 2019 was submitted last Friday. So my questions are, do you, I'm sure you have had a chance to look at it. Do you support that budget? Will your party support that budget proposal? Do you think that that is a budget that can be executed? Or is it the case, as always we think in Brazil, that the budgets are a number of mysterious tables that are incomprehensible for any average person to understand, and it will just be disputed afterwards? That's one part of the question. The other part of the question is, you mentioned the idea that, yes, we need to go back to a question of fiscal responsibility. In your mind, is there a difference in the path or in the priorities that one takes in this, in addressing the return of a fiscal surplus and the return to debt sustainability, and the discussions about the size of the state? In other words, is there some priority in how one addresses these issues? And finally, on the fiscal side, you've made some excellent analysis in the past about the success of the monetary transition in Brazil at the time of the Plano Real, that somehow the institutions were made at that time that have proven to be workable on the monetary side. And somehow Brazil, as you know, with the arrangement between the central bank and the Conselho Monetário Nacional and all of that, and the inflation targeting regime, it seems to have a monetary system that is workable. But that doesn't seem to be the case on the fiscal side, despite the various reforms. I mean, the DRU, the fiscal responsibility law, the ceiling, that law that was implemented last year. So do you think that is a question that still needs to be addressed?
Well, Paulo, I couldn't agree more. Let me start by your third remark. It's yes, I think we've been successful in protecting money creation from fiscal influences. That is no small task. We had to do some magic with public banks and rules for monetary governance, which proved pretty resilient. They resisted the attack of Dilma Rousseff in a major way. We didn't have much inflation resulting from all this catastrophe that Mrs. Rousseff produced, thanks to institutions. We appreciate the importance of institutions more today than ever before, thanks to that experience. But yes, we couldn't do the job regarding fiscal policy, and that comes to your first remark on the budget, because yes, it's too complex, and it's been made over the years to have some configuration reflecting political economy considerations. The budget today in Brazil continues to be like a authorization to spend, right? And a guesstimate of revenues. That is what the Brazilian budget is, right? So very little enforcement or very little obligations once you guesstimate revenues, authorize spending, and you execute a portion of expenses that are not the ones that you cannot ration, like wages and interest. And there's a big fight on making your piece of the expenditure pile more compulsory than the others. All are compulsory and rigid, but all can be in some way diminished by a variety of forms. So we didn't have done the job of reforming the budget, and the budget is the heart, the economic heart of democracy, is where you should see the representatives of the people discussing priorities of taxation, spending, indebtedness, and all that. No, we don't have these considerations in our budget. We will need a reform in budget laws to do that. You will remark, and I'm sure you're thinking on, well, what's the fiscal responsibilities all about? And the answer is, well, it was a law that put together all the limitations we had to indebtedness in one simple law, and also with a number of precautionary fiscal rules, but it doesn't touch the budget, right? It's the birth of spending. It's untouched by the fiscal responsibility law. The only thing you do, you try to introduce limits and discipline in indebtedness, okay? So we need to do the second half of the institution building in as far as fiscal policy is concerned. But it sounds okay, but it's more difficult than that, because most of the spending, or substantial part of the spending is fixed by the Constitution. So you can change the budget law the way you can possibly imagine, but doesn't change the obligation of spending on Social Security as determined by the Constitution. So amongst ourselves, reformers in the fiscal front, and I remember the days I was there during the Real years, the discussion was whether we should do something like limitations on top of the situations that we already have, or working on the birth of spending, right? So recently we have done something similar to what we've done in the past with the DRU you mentioned, which is the ceiling rule, the PEC do teto, which is a constitutional limitation to the rate of growth of primary spending. This is as far as a budgetary innovation that is kind of, hard to see something like that in other countries, but that's the way you can create some automatic stabilizers or automatic rules for cutting spending when you go kind of over the roof in terms of the rate of growth of spending. But it's, of course, you have to do that parallel to working on big reforms affecting the velocity with which the Constitution makes spending grow. And Social Security system is the one thing that is urgent now. And lastly, there's a dialogue between your initiatives to run the short-run fiscal policy number, right? To exhibit either deficit or surplus in the primary accounts, and what's happening with big reforms. I give you an example. During the first years of the Real Plan, with all credibility that we had, we couldn't exhibit a positive fiscal surplus primary, right? The primary surplus was nearly zero in 1994, second semester, 5, 6, 7, only 1998, we successfully turned the fiscal accounts into a surplus. So how could we possibly have stabilized without a fiscal surplus? And that is a interesting question, because it actually tells you that when the public is focusing on the big reforms and see their long run impacts on the fiscal accounts, they worry less about the more recent number on the fiscal accounts. They understand that there's a lot more at stake when you are driving well regarding Social Security reform. These are the truly important issues. Of course, we have to work both. And in our case, in the late 90s, we got complacent about the short run numbers because we're doing too well in the field of reforms. Well, right now we're not doing well in either count, which is kind of bad. But the next government will have a big chance to launch big reforms that would normally diminish the attention, the sensitivity people have on the primary result. And that will give us perhaps a couple of years of comfort to try to work on big reforms. And a couple of years is more than needed to address the short run tricks that we all know there are for reducing spending and produce a positive fiscal number. That's it.
Great. Well, I know we've gone a little bit over time already, and it's been a fascinating discussion. And we thank you again extremely for your time and giving us such a comprehensive discussion. So thank you so much. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.